Hello and welcome. Today we are diving deep into the absolute fundamentals of life itself. We're going to use some really cool analogies to build a super clear picture of how biology works, from the tiniest microscopic parts to the massive world around us.
Really think about that for a second. How does one single tiny cell contain all the instructions to build something as incredibly complex as a giant redwood tree, a whale, or you? Well, that's exactly the mystery we're going to unravel together. So where does a story this big even begin?
It all starts right here with the basic building block of every single living thing on this planet, the cell. And probably the best way to get your head around a cell is to picture it as its own bustling microscopic city.
Yep, that's right. It doesn't matter if it's a little bacterium or a massive blue whale made of trillions of them. Everything alive is built from these fundamental little units. Every single cell is its own self-contained world, handling everything from bringing in food to getting rid of waste. Now, a city isn't just an empty box, right? It's got different departments, infrastructure, all that stuff that makes it work. A cell is exactly the same. It's filled with these tiny structures called organelles, and each one has a very specific job that it's got to do to keep the whole city alive and running. And this gives us a fantastic bird's eye view of our little cell city. So right in the center, you've got the nucleus. Think of it as a city hall, holding all the important blueprints. Then you have the mitochondria. These are the power plants, working 24/7, turning food into usable energy. And wrapping around the whole thing is the cell membrane, which is kind of like the city border, complete with security, controlling exactly what gets in and what gets out. Okay, so let's take a little trip into that city hall, into the nucleus, and get a closer look at that master blueprint we were talking about. This is where all the instructions for building and running the entire city are kept.
And this incredible molecule is DNA. The easiest way to think about it? It's like a giant cookbook. And inside this cookbook are all the individual recipes, we call them genes, that hold the specific instructions for building and operating an entire living thing.
So how does a recipe in a book become, well, reality? It's actually a pretty straightforward three-step process. First, the cell picks an individual recipe to read. That's the gene. Second, it follows that recipe to cook up a very specific dish. That's a protein. And finally, that protein creates a trade, which is basically how the final dish looks and works. This is literally how a gene for eye color results in you having blue or brown eyes.
And this is where the details become absolutely critical. Just like in a real recipe, the exact order of the chemical ingredients in DNA, these things called nucleotides, determines what the final protein is going to look like. You change that order even a little bit, and you could get a completely different result. Which brings us to mutations. What's a mutation? Well, it's basically a typo in the recipe. It's just a change in that sequence of DNA. Now, sometimes a typo doesn't really matter. It doesn't change the final dish at all. Other times it can be harmful. But what's really fascinating is that every once in a while, a typo can actually improve the recipe, leading to a brand new beneficial trait. Okay, so we've got our cell city, we've got its cookbook full of blueprints, but none of that is going to work without power. So how does the city, and the whole organism for that matter, get the energy it needs to function? It really comes down to two main processes that are two sides of the same coin. On one side, you have photosynthesis. You can think of this as a solar-powered kitchen where plants actually make their own food. And on the other side, you have cellular respiration, which is like taking that food and burning it as fuel to power everything else. So first up, let's look at that solar-powered kitchen. Photosynthesis is this amazing process where plants take in sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide, and they use those ingredients to literally bake their own food, sugar. And as a pretty amazing bonus for us, they release the oxygen we need to breathe. And now for the power plant. This is cellular respiration. Organisms, and that includes you and me, we take in that sugar and oxygen. And inside those mitochondria we talked about, that sugar and oxygen are basically burned to release a steady stream of energy that powers every single thing the cell does, from building stuff to dividing. But here's the thing, right? None of these cells, none of these organisms exist in a bubble. They're all deeply, deeply connected. They're all part of a huge, complicated web of relationships that we call an ecosystem. Life is organized in layers of ever-increasing complexity. It all starts with those basic cells. Then groups of similar cells get together to form tissues. Tissues combine to make organs. Organs work together in organ systems. All of those systems come together to make one organism. And communities of all those different organisms interacting with their environment, well, that's a whole ecosystem.
And this image shows that connection just perfectly. A food web is all about showing how energy flows. So the energy captured by producers, like this kelp, using photosynthesis, gets passed along. The sea urchin comes along and eats the kelp, then the sea otter eats the sea urchin. It's this delicate chain of energy transfer that shows how every single organism really depends on the others to survive.
So now let's zoom all the way out. We've gone from the cell city to the web of energy, and now we're going to look at the biggest story of them all, the epic, billions of years long story of how life itself changes over time.
And that story is called evolution. At its heart, it's really simple. It's just the process of change in the traits that get passed down in a group of organisms over many, many generations. It's not about one animal changing during its lifetime, but about the entire group slowly shifting over huge spans of time. So how does that change actually happen? Well, the main engine driving it is something called natural selection. You can picture it as this massive, planet-wide survival competition. Organisms that happen to have traits that give them an edge, say better camouflage or resistance to a disease, they're just more likely to survive, have more kids, and pass those winning traits on. And this slide is the perfect visual for how natural selection works. So imagine a population of beetles. Before some big change, you've got a mix of light ones and dark ones. But then the environment changes. Maybe the ground gets darker from soot. All of a sudden, the dark beetles are way harder for birds to see. So they survive longer, they have more babies, and over time, the entire beetle population shifts to become darker. The whole group has adapted. So, from the tiny organelles working inside a cell city, all the way to the grand sweep of evolution, it's all one single continuous story. It's a story that started billions of years ago, and it's still being written all around us, and even inside us, every single day. Which really makes you wonder, what's the next chapter going to be?